On the afternoon of November 4th, 1846, a party of 81 immigrants found themselves stranded near the eastern shore of what is now called Donner Lake, high in the Sierra Nevada of California. Their wagons were stopped by deep snow. They had been traveling for nearly 6 months, having left Springfield, Illinois, in mid-April. They had hoped to cross the mountains before winter, but the snow had come early. That afternoon, a heavy storm rolled in, and by nightfall the pass ahead was buried under several feet of powder. The party made camp. They believed it would be a temporary delay. It was not. What began as a routine westward migration would become the most infamous story of starvation, isolation, and survival in American history. The group that ended up at the lake was not a single organized company, but a collection of families and individuals who had broken off from a larger train. The core consisted of two families, the Donners and the Reeds. George Donner was a 62-year-old farmer from Illinois, traveling with his wife Tamsin and their 5 daughters. His brother Jacob Donner came with his wife Elizabeth and 7 children. James Reed, a wealthy Irish-born furniture maker, traveled with his wife Margaret and their 4 children plus servants. Together, the Donner and Reed families formed the backbone of what would later be called the Donner Party. They were not reckless people. They were experienced overlanders. James Reed had served in the Black Hawk War. George Donner had helped survey roads, but they made one catastrophic choice. In the spring of 1846, as they prepared to leave Independence, Missouri, a new route was being promoted by a man named Lansford Hastings. Hastings had published a guidebook promising a shorter, faster path to California. He called it the Hastings Cutoff. It would supposedly cut 300 miles off the standard Oregon-California trail. The catch was that Hastings had never fully scouted the route himself. He had ridden through parts of the Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Desert, but his claims were based on rough estimates. Still, the idea was tempting. The main trail was slow and crowded. If the cutoff worked, it could save weeks. James Reed read Hastings' book and became convinced. He corresponded with Hastings and obtained maps. Reed persuaded George Donner and several other families to join him. On July 20th, 1846, the party reached Fort Bridger in present-day Wyoming. There they met Hastings himself, who assured them the cutoff was open. He gave them a guide, but the guide soon left. The party entered the Wasatch Mountains on July 31st. Almost immediately, they ran into trouble. The Wasatch Range was a maze of canyons, cliffs, and thick timber. There was no trail. The wagons had to be chopped through dense brush, lifted over boulders, and lowered down steep slopes. It took them 16 days to travel 36 miles. They lost precious time. Temperatures were hot and water was scarce. By the time they emerged from the mountains on August 12th, they were already behind schedule. But the worst was yet to come. Hastings had told them that a desert crossing lay ahead, 80 miles of salt flats with no water. He said it could be crossed in 2 days. The party prepared for a fast push. They filled barrels with water and gathered grass for the oxen. On August 15th, they began the crossing. It was a disaster. The desert was longer and hotter than Hastings had described. The salt crust broke under the wagon wheels, forcing the oxen to pull through soft, alkaline dust. The water ran out. People became delirious. Some drank their own urine. One man, Luke Halloran, died of tuberculosis during the crossing. Another wagon broke down and the oxen wandered away. The party pushed on, staggering through the heat. They reached the Humboldt River on the far side after 4 harrowing days, but they had lost more time. Their supplies were running low. After the desert, the party followed the Humboldt River west across present-day Nevada. It was late August. They were now at least a month behind the main emigration. Other travelers on the standard trail had already crossed the Sierra Nevada in July. The Donner Party still had hundreds of miles to go. Tensions rose. On October 5th, a violent argument broke out between James Reed and a teamster named John Snyder. Snyder had been whipping his oxen and Reed intervened. Words were exchanged. Snyder swung his whip at Reed. Reed drew a knife. In the struggle, Reed stabbed Snyder in the chest. Snyder died within minutes. The other immigrants were horrified. They held a meeting. Some wanted to hang Reed. Instead, they banished him. Reed was forced to leave his family behind. He rode ahead alone, taking a horse and some supplies. He promised to send back help. He reached Sutter's Fort in California on October 28th, but by then the snow was already falling in the mountains. The remaining party, now led by George Donner, continued west. They reached the Truckee River and followed it into the Sierra foothills. On October 20th, they began the ascent of the Truckee Pass, later known as Donner Pass. The weather was pleasant. They had a few days of clear skies, but snow began to fall on October 28th. By the time they reached the lake on October 31st, several inches had accumulated. They stopped at a cabin built the previous year by a man named William Mountain Murphy. Another group of the party, including the Donners, camped 6 miles back at Alder Creek. On November 4th, a major storm dumped several feet of snow. The pass was now impassable. The immigrants found themselves trapped. They had no way forward and no way back. They had not prepared for a winter in the mountains. Their food supply was meant to last until Sacramento, not through months of snow. They had some cattle, but the animals would soon die or be slaughtered. They had some flour, beans, and dried meat, but it was not enough for 81 people for an entire winter. What happened? The Donner Party did not simply starve in the wilderness. They made decisions, tried to escape, and ultimately resorted to the unthinkable. The story is often reduced to cannibalism, but the full picture is far more complex. It involves a series of failed rescue attempts, a breakdown of social order, and a desperate struggle against the elements. To understand what really happened, we have to look at the 6 months that followed the first snow. After the November storm, the party settled into their makeshift shelters. The Murphy family cabin was a single-room structure, about 20 feet by 20 feet, built of logs. More than 20 people crowded into that cabin. The Donner families built tents and lean-tos near Alder Creek. Conditions were brutal. Snow continued to fall. By December, drifts reached 10 feet. People huddled together for warmth. The cattle died. The oxen starved or were slaughtered. Meat was salted and stored, but it was not enough. By early December, the food was almost gone. The strongest members of the party decided to attempt a crossing of the pass on foot. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. On December 16th, 15 men and 5 women set out. They carried 6 days of supplies. They had improvised snowshoes made from ox bows and rawhide. They intended to reach California and bring back help. The journey was a nightmare. The snow was deep. The terrain was steep. They made slow progress. By the 4th day, they had run out of food. They began to starve. A few days later, several members of the group became too weak to continue. On December 21st, a man named Charles Stanton collapsed and died. Stanton had been a guide for the party and had helped them earlier. His body was left in the snow. Desperation set in. The survivors were lost, freezing and starving. On December 24th, one of the men, William Foster, shot and killed another man, William Pike, in a delusional fit. But the real horror began on December 25th. That day, the group resorted to cannibalism for the first time. They cut flesh from the body of Charles Stanton. They ate it raw. It was a decision they did not make lightly, but they believed it was the only way to survive. The group continued on. More members died. More bodies were consumed. On January 17, 1847, after 33 days of walking, the 7 surviving members of the Forlorn Hope reached a Native American village near present-day Emigrant Gap. They were skeletal, frostbitten, and barely alive. The Miwok people gave them food and shelter. Then they made contact with settlers in California. Word of the trapped party spread. In late January, a rescue party was organized by James Reed, who had reached the safety of the Sacramento Valley. He had tried to get help earlier, but the snow blocked his first attempt. Now, with the Forlorn Hope survivors telling their story, a larger effort began. The first relief party, led by a man named John McGlashan, set out on February 5th. They carried food and supplies. They reached the lake on February 18th. What they found was a scene of utter devastation. The survivors in the cabins were weak, starved, and barely alive. Many had died. Those who remained had also resorted to cannibalism. The relief party distributed food and helped the strongest prepare to leave. They led 23 survivors out of the mountains on February 22nd. They made it safely to California, but dozens remained behind. A second relief party arrived in early March. They were supposed to bring out more people, but the snow was still deep, and the members of the second relief were not as organized. They took only a few survivors. A third relief party went in late March. They found more bodies. The last survivor, a man named Louis Kesselberg, was pulled from a cabin on April 17th. He was the only person left alive. He had been living on the bodies of the dead. In total, 48 members of the Donner Party survived. 33 perished. Of those who died, some starved, some froze, and some were killed. Many were eaten. The cannibalism was not a secret. The survivors spoke of it openly to rescuers and later in letters and interviews. The story horrified the nation. It became a cautionary tale about overconfidence and the dangers of the frontier. How could this have happened? Historians have examined the party's decisions and the conditions that led to their entrapment. The Hastings cutoff was the primary cause. It delayed the party by weeks, but there were other factors. The party was large and unwieldy. There was no strong central leadership after Reed was banished. The seasonal weather that year was especially severe. Snowdrifts in the Sierra reached record depths, and once trapped, the party lacked the tools and knowledge to survive. They had no snowshoes. They had no extra food. They did not hunt. They did not fish. They waited. The rescue efforts were also flawed. The first relief party arrived relatively quickly, but they could only take a few people. The second relief party was poorly organized and left too soon. Some rescuers were accused of stealing supplies. The third relief party came only because Kesselberg was reported alive. If the rescues had been larger and faster, more lives might have been saved. But the deeper question is not just about logistics. It is about human behavior under extreme pressure. The Donner Party disintegrated into small factions. Some families hoarded food, others shared. Some died willingly, others killed. The cannibalism was not random. It followed a pattern. The dead were usually those who died of natural causes first, but later, as starvation worsened, some survivors resorted to killing the weak. There were accusations of murder. Kesselberg was particularly reviled. Rumors spread that he had killed a boy named George Foster for food. Kesselberg denied it, but the stigma followed him for the rest of his life. The story of the Donner Party remains important because it forces us to confront the limits of civilization. These were ordinary people, farmers, merchants, mothers, who believed in progress and the promise of California. They were not criminals. They were not monsters. They were people who made a bad decision based on bad information and then found themselves in a situation where the rules of society no longer applied. The winter in the Sierra Nevada stripped away everything but the will to live. Investigators in the modern sense, historians, archaeologists, and forensic scientists, have spent decades studying the Donner Party. They have excavated the sites, analyzed the remains, and reconstructed the events. What they found confirms the horror but also reveals something else, the extraordinary resilience of those who survived. Many of them went on to build new lives in California. James Reed became a successful rancher. Margaret Reed remarried. The Donner daughters married and had families. They carried the memory of that winter, but they also carried forward. The Donner Party is not a story of simple failure. It is a story of human endurance, of choices made in a vacuum of information, and of what happens when the systems we rely on, roads, supplies, leadership, weather predictions, all break down. It still matters because every winter people still get trapped in the Sierra Nevada. Hikers, drivers, skiers, they underestimate the mountains. The Donner Party is a permanent warning carved into the granite of history, but the warning is not only about the mountains. It is about the decisions made before anyone saw snow. The Donner Party's entrapment did not begin in November 1846. It began months earlier in July when the group left Independence, Missouri, as part of a larger wagon train. They were part of the Great Westward Migration, a mass movement of settlers following the Oregon Trail. The party was not originally called the Donner Party. It was the rear section of a larger train, led by a man named William H. Russell. The Donner families, George and Jacob Donner, along with their wives and children, were simply one of several families traveling together. The turning point came on July 20th, 1846, at the Little Sandy River in present-day Wyoming. There, the party encountered a letter written by Lansford Hastings, a promoter who claimed he had discovered a shortcut to California. The Hastings Cutoff, as it became known, promised to save 300 to 400 miles. The letter, dated May 1846, was carried by a messenger named James Clyman, who had actually traveled the route. Clyman warned Hastings that the route was too dangerous for wagons. But Hastings had already left for California, and his written assurances were persuasive. The Donner Party split. Most of the larger train chose the established route, but the Donners, the Reeds, and several other families decided to try the cutoff. They elected George Donner as captain. On July 31st, they left the main trail. The decision was based on a single piece of paper and the promise of a faster journey. It was a gamble based on incomplete information. What the Hastings Cutoff actually offered was a nightmare. The route went through the Wasatch Mountains, then across the Great Salt Lake Desert. The party spent weeks hacking through dense forests and canyons. They lost wagons, oxen, and time. By the time they reached the desert, they were exhausted. The crossing of the Salt Flats took 5 days. Water was scarce. The alkaline dust blinded animals. Several wagons were abandoned. By late August, the party had fallen far behind schedule. When they finally reached the Humboldt River in Nevada, they had lost nearly a month. The original Hastings Cutoff had taken longer than the established route. The party was now heading into the Sierra Nevada at the worst possible time, late October. The pass is typically closed by November. They were racing a clock they could not see. The party continued westward along the Humboldt River. Tempers flared. On October 5th, James Reed killed a man named John Snyder in a fight over oxen. Reed was banished by the party. He rode ahead alone toward California. He promised to send back supplies. He kept that promise, but his banishment left the party without a strong leader. George Donner was older and indecisive. The party fragmented. By the time they reached the Truckee River on October 25th, the first snow had already fallen in the Sierra. A group of men from the party, including Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon, had gone ahead to Sutter's Fort to get supplies. They returned on October 19th with 7 mules loaded with food. But the snow was already accumulating. The party rested for several days, hoping the weather would clear. It did not. On October 31st, the party attempted to cross the pass. They made it within 2 miles of the summit, but the snow was too deep. Wagons bogged down. Oxen died. They turned back to a lake at the base of the pass, now known as Donner Lake. They built cabins. The Donner families camped near Alder Creek a few miles away. The winter had begun. Now the timeline sharpens. By November 4th, the snow was 4 feet deep. By November 12th, it was 6 feet. On November 20th, the last attempt to cross the pass on foot failed. The party was trapped. The food they had was meant for a crossing, not a siege. The cattle that survived were slaughtered. The meat was rationed. By December 1st, the daily ration per person was less than a pound of meat. By December 10th, it was half that. The Forlorn Hope Party, the group of 17 who set out on December 16th, represented the strongest and most desperate. They took 6 days of food. Their snowshoes were crude. They made it only a few miles per day. On December 20th, they ran out of food. On December 21st, Charles Stanton died. The group gathered his body. They debated. On December 25th, they ate him. The survivors of the Forlorn Hope continued moving westward. They ate the bodies of those who died next: Antonio, a native guide; William Pike, who was shot; a man named J. Fosdick; a woman named Harriet Pike; and several others. By the time they were rescued on January 17th, they had consumed the flesh of at least 5 people. The group included women and children. The cannibalism was a matter of survival, but it left psychological scars that never healed. Meanwhile, back at the lake, conditions worsened. By January, the snow had reached 15 feet in places. The cabins were buried, people could barely move. The Murphy cabin was the worst. More than 20 people huddled in that 20 by 20 space. The floor was dirt. The walls were logs. The roof was branches and canvas. The temperature inside rarely rose above freezing. People died almost weekly. Patrick Breen kept a diary. His entries are grim. On December 15th, he wrote, "Still snowing, no food, no fuel." On December 28th, "Last of our cattle killed." On January 7th, Mrs. Murphy's child died. On January 15th, people very weak, eating hides. The hides were boiled into a gelatinous stew. They burned furniture for heat. They ate the bones of dead cattle, ground into powder. By late January, the first relief party had not yet arrived. The survivors began to die in clusters. The Breen family survived because they had a little more food. The Donner family at Alder Creek was even worse off. The snow there was deeper. The tents collapsed. George Donner had injured his hand while building a shelter. The wound became infected. He grew weak and died in late March. His wife Tamsin refused to leave him until the very end. The first relief party, consisting of 7 men led by John McGlashan, set out from Sutter's Fort on February 5th. They carried 7 days of food. They used snowshoes. They made slow progress. On February 18th, they reached the lake. What they saw was beyond anything they had prepared for. The survivors were emaciated. Some could barely move. The cabins reeked of death. The relief party found human bones, flesh, and half-eaten bodies. They distributed food and prepared to lead the strongest back across the pass. On February 22nd, the first relief departed with 23 survivors. They walked out of the snow. The journey took 4 days. They lost 3 more people along the way, including 2 children, but 20 made it to safety. The first relief had planned to return immediately, but the weather turned again. It took another 2 weeks to organize a second party. The second relief, now under the command of James Reed, set out on March 1st. Reed had been banished, but he had kept his word. He returned to rescue his family. The second relief reached the lake on March 13th. They found the cabins even more desolate. More had died. The survivors included the Murphy children, the Donner children, and the Breen family. Reed found his wife Margaret alive and 2 of his children, but one daughter, Patty, had died in January. The second relief was poorly supplied. They had only enough food for themselves. They could not carry everyone out. They took 17 survivors, including most of the Reed family, and left the others with a promise to return. But the second relief was plagued by infighting. Some members of the relief party stole supplies from the cabins. One rescuer, a man named John Clark, later admitted to taking food meant for the stranded. The rescued survivors reached safety by March 18th, but they left behind a scene of chaos. The third relief, led by a man named William Fallen, set out on March 27th. They found the lake mostly empty. Many of those left behind had died. They found George Donner dead at Alder Creek. His wife Tamsin was also dead. She had tried to walk to the lake but died in the snow. The relief party gathered the remaining survivors. They found Louis Kesselberg alone in the Murphy cabin. Kesselberg was alive but weak. He had been living on the bodies of the dead. The relief party was horrified. They accused Kesselberg of murder. He admitted to eating human flesh but denied killing anyone. He claimed he had simply found the dead and used their bodies to survive. The third relief removed Kesselberg and the last remaining children. They reached the valley on April 17th. The Donner party was over. The aftermath was a national scandal. The newspapers called it the cannibal camp. The survivors were shunned by some. Louis Kesselberg was sued by the family of a man he was accused of eating. The case was dismissed. Kesselberg moved to New York and lived in obscurity. James Reed became a respected rancher. Margaret Reed raised her children. The Breen family settled in San Juan Bautista. The Murphy children were adopted. The Donner daughters married and had families, but the trauma never ended. Many survivors refused to speak about the winter. Some did in letters and memoirs. The accounts are inconsistent. Some said cannibalism was only done after death. Others said it was done to the dying. The truth is buried in the snow by the lake. Archaeologists have excavated the site several times. In 1871, a farmer found bones and artifacts. In 1900, a monument was erected. In the 193s rows, the site was designated a state historic park. In the 1990s, forensic anthropologists studied the bones. They found cut marks consistent with butchery. They found human remains mixed with animal remains. They confirmed the cannibalism, but they also found evidence of malnutrition, disease, and exposure. The cause of death was not always starvation. Some died of hypothermia, some died of infections, some were murdered. The systems that failed were not only the Hastings cutoff. The U.S. government had not mapped the Sierra passes. There was no emergency rescue network. There was no communication. The party had no way to signal for help. The rescuers had no way to know where the party was. The weather forecasts were non-existent. The survival skills of the party were minimal. They did not know how to hunt in deep snow. They did not know how to build snow shelters. They did not know how to preserve food. They were farmers and merchants, not mountain men. The event still matters because it asks a question that has no easy answer. What would you do? The Donner Party faced a test that most people never face. They passed the test by failing, but they also passed it by surviving. The 48 who lived carried the weight of the 33 who died. They carried the weight of the cannibalism. They carried the weight of the decisions made in July 1846. Today, the Donner Pass is a highway. Cars drive over it in minutes. The lake is a tourist spot. The cabins are gone, but the story remains. It is a story about overconfidence, about the cost of shortcuts, about the thin line between civilization and wilderness. It is a story that begins with a letter and ends with bones in the snow. The documentary record is clear. The party's own letters, diaries, and testimonies tell the same story. The archaeological evidence supports it. The historical consensus is that the Donner Party was a tragedy of errors, but it was not inevitable. If the party had not taken the Hastings cutoff, they would have crossed the pass in October. If they had not banished Reed, they might have had stronger leadership. If the weather had been normal, they might have survived. But the weather was not normal. The snow was deeper than anyone had seen. The pass did not clear until May. In the end, the Donner Party is a permanent warning. It says, do not trust shortcuts. Do not ignore the warnings of those who know the land. Do not think you are immune to the laws of nature. The Sierra Nevada is still there. Every winter it still kills people who underestimate it. The difference is that now we have roads, snowplows, GPS, and rescue teams. But the mountains do not care. They are still the same mountains that trapped the Donner Party in 1846. The granite is still the same. The snow is still the same. And the outcome of poor decisions is still the same. The story does not end with the rescue. It continues in the lives of the survivors, in the history books, in the tourist signs, and in the silences of families who carry the memory. It continues in the work of archaeologists who still find bones. It continues in the questions we ask: how could this have happened? And what would we do? The Donner Party answers with silence. The snow covers everything. On April 29, 1847, Louis Keseberg arrived at Sutter's Fort, the last surviving member of the Donner Party to reach safety. He was carried on a litter, barely conscious. His legs were swollen from starvation. His skin was discolored. He had lost nearly half his body weight. The rescuers who brought him down had to physically restrain some of the other survivors, who demanded Keseberg be hanged on the spot. The accusations against him had already spread. He was said to have murdered Tamsen Donner. He was said to have hoarded food. He was said to have eaten human flesh with no remorse. Keseberg denied murder. He admitted to the cannibalism. He insisted he had only used the bodies of those who had died from starvation, exposure, or disease. He claimed Tamsen Donner had chosen to stay with her dying husband and had perished on the trail while trying to reach the lake cabins. The relief party found no evidence of foul play. No weapon was recovered. No signs of struggle were visible in the snow. Yet the accusations persisted. They would follow Keseberg for the rest of his life. What happened after the last rescue? The survivors scattered across California. They tried to rebuild. But the story of the Donner Party did not end in the Sierra Nevada. It became a public spectacle. Newspapers from San Francisco to New York printed lurid accounts. The word cannibalism appeared in headlines. The public was horrified and fascinated. The survivors were shunned by some communities. They were interrogated by reporters. They were asked to describe the taste of human flesh, the color of the flesh, the texture, the smell. Most survivors refused to answer. Some gave vague statements. A few, like James Reed, wrote detailed memoirs that omitted the cannibalism altogether. Reed presented his family as victims of a terrible storm, not participants in survival cannibalism. He emphasized the courage of the rescuers. He downplayed the darkest details. Other survivors, like the Breen family, remained silent for decades. They refused to speak to journalists. They raised their children in small towns, hoping to escape the stigma. The children of the Donner Party grew up with whispered rumors. Some changed their names. Some moved across the country. The trauma passed down through generations. The legal aftermath was limited. In 1848, the family of a man named William Foster sued Louis Keseberg for the alleged murder of Tamsen Donner. Foster claimed Keseberg had killed Tamsen for her money. The case went to court in San Francisco. The testimony was contradictory. The Relief Party members could not agree on what they had found. Some said Keseberg had a pot of human flesh boiling when they arrived. Others said the cabin was bare. The judge dismissed the case for lack of evidence. Keseberg was cleared, but he was not exonerated in the court of public opinion. He moved to New York in the 1850s. He lived in poverty. He died in 1895 in a sanatorium. His death certificate listed chronic gastritis as the cause. Some historians believe he never recovered from the trauma of the winter. The other survivors fared differently. James Reed became a wealthy rancher in San Jose. He served as a city councilman. He built a large home for his family. His children married well. His daughter, Patty Reed, who had survived the winter, later wrote a memoir that became a primary source for historians. She described the snow, the hunger, the death of her sister. She did not describe cannibalism. She said she never saw it. Other survivors, like the Breen children, also wrote accounts. They admitted they had seen human flesh being prepared. They said it was done by others. They said they had not participated. The accounts are contradictory. Some said the cannibalism began in December. Others said it started in February. Some said it was limited to a few individuals. Others said it was widespread. The truth is buried not only in the snow but in the silence of the survivors. In the 1870s, as the first generation of survivors began to die, interest in the Donner Party revived. A farmer named John S. Hittel published an article in the Overland Monthly in 1879. He interviewed survivors. He visited the site. He found bones scattered around the lake. He collected artifacts. He wrote a detailed account that included the cannibalism. The article sparked a new wave of public discussion. Some survivors wrote letters to the editor defending their actions. They argued that the cannibalism was necessary for survival. They argued that it was no different from eating animals. Others were horrified that the story was being recounted. They wanted it forgotten. In 1900, the Native Sons of the Golden West erected a monument at Donner Lake. The monument was a simple granite obelisk. It listed the names of the party members. It did not mention cannibalism. It read, "To the memory of the Donner Party who endured terrible sufferings and many of whom found their graves in the Sierra Nevada." The monument was dedicated on June 6, 1900. Hundreds of people attended. The surviving family members were present. They laid wreaths. They wept. The monument still stands today. In the 193s, the site was designated a California State Historic Park. The state built a museum. The museum displayed artifacts: a knife, a cooking pot, a shoe, a piece of rope. The museum did not emphasize cannibalism. The official narrative focused on the courage of the rescuers. It was not until the 1990s that the full archaeological record was analyzed. In 1991, a team of forensic anthropologists led by Dr. James R. White conducted a systematic excavation of the Donner Party campsites. They used modern techniques. They sifted soil. They recovered thousands of bone fragments. Some were human, some were animal. They analyzed cut marks. They found evidence of butchery on human bones. The cuts matched those made by the same knives used to butcher cattle. The bones had been broken open to extract marrow. The team published their findings in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 1994. They concluded that cannibalism had occurred at both the lake camps and the Alder Creek camps. They found no evidence of murder. The cut marks were consistent with post-mortem dismemberment. The bodies had been processed after death. But the forensic team also found evidence of something else. The survivors had tried to survive by other means. They had hunted squirrels. They had eaten pine nuts. They had boiled leather. They had eaten bones. The cannibalism was a last resort. It did not begin until late January or early February. By then, most of the party was already dead. The cannibals were not monsters. They were desperate. How could this have happened? The systems that failed were not just the Hastings cutoff. The U.S. government had not yet conducted a thorough survey of the Sierra Nevada. The maps were inaccurate. The party had no reliable terrain data. They had no radios. They had no way to communicate with the outside world. They had no emergency provisions. The assumption that a wagon train could cross the mountains in late October was based on hope, not experience. The Donner Party was not the first group to attempt a late crossing, but they were the least prepared. Earlier parties had carried extra supplies. They had wintered in the mountains before. They had built snow shelters. The Donner Party had none of that. The weather in 1846 was also abnormal. Historical tree ring data shows that the winter of 1846-1847 was one of the snowiest in the Sierra Nevada in the last 500 years. The snowfall was 3 to 4 times the average. The snowpack did not melt until late May. Even a well-prepared party would have struggled. The Donner Party had no chance. The leadership also failed. George Donner was a kind man but not a strong leader. He deferred to others. He did not enforce discipline. James Reed was more decisive, but he was banished at a critical moment. The remaining leaders like William Eddy and Patrick Breen were capable but divided. They argued about how to ration food. They argued about whether to set up a camp at the lake or at the pass. They argued about whether to send out a snowshoe party. The lack of unity cost lives. The snowshoe party itself was a failure of planning. They left on December 16th with 6 days of food. They did not carry snowshoes that worked well. They did not bring enough blankets. They did not know the route. They got lost. They ran out of food. They turned to cannibalism. Only 7 of the 15 survived. The rest died or were eaten. The survivors included William Eddy, the most capable hunter in the party. He later testified that he had never expected to survive. He said the cannibalism was not a choice. It was a necessity. The rescuers were not without blame. The first relief party, led by John McGlashan, arrived on February 18th. They had only 7 days of food. They had to ration. They could not carry all the survivors. They made bad decisions. They left the weakest behind. They also stole from the cabins. John Clark and his companions took food that was meant for the stranded. They justified it by saying they needed it themselves. The second relief, led by James Reed, was better intentioned but poorly supplied. They ran out of food before they reached the cabins. They had to eat their own pack animals. They arrived weak. They could only take 17 survivors. The others were left with a promise that never came. The third relief, led by William Fallon, arrived too late. They found the cabins empty of the living except Louis Kesselberg. They found the dead scattered. They did not know what had happened. They accused Kesselberg of murder. They found Tamsin Donner's body near the lake. They found George Donner's body at Alder Creek. They found human bones in cooking pots. They left the site in disgust. They brought Kesselberg and the last children down. The rescue was over. The aftermath of the Donner Party is not only about the survivors. It is about the families of the dead. It is about the national conversation about cannibalism. In the 1850s, Western frontier literature often portrayed Native Americans as savages who practiced cannibalism. The Donner Party forced white Americans to confront the fact that they could descend into the same behavior. The difference, many argued, was that the Donner Party did it out of necessity, not ritual. But the memory was still shameful. The story was suppressed in school textbooks for decades. Only in the 20th century did historians begin to treat it as a serious historical event. Today, the Donner Party is studied in history classes. It is the subject of books, documentaries, and films. The cannibalism is often the sensational hook, but the deeper lesson is about preparation, leadership, and the limits of human endurance. The party that left Springfield, Illinois, in April 1846 had every reason to believe they would make it to California. They followed the advice of a published guidebook. They listened to a man who claimed to know a shortcut. They did not question his credentials. They did not send scouts ahead. They did not prepare for winter. They did not carry extra food. They did not build snowshoes until it was too late. The systems that failed them were not only the Hastings cutoff. The party's own confidence was a system. The belief that the West could be conquered by sheer will was a system. The trust in a single man's word was a system. These systems failed. They failed because they were not tested. The Donner Party was a test. It failed, but the survivors also succeeded. They endured. They passed on their genes. They built families. They contributed to the settlement of California. James Reed's descendants number in the thousands. The Breen family thrived. The Murphy children grew up. The Donner daughters married and raised children. They carried the memory. They did not let the story be forgot. The lake today is still there. The Sierra Nevada is still there. Every winter the snow falls. Every summer the pass reopens. The monument stands. The museum tells the story. The bones are buried in museum archives. The questions remain. Why did the Donner Party fail? The answer is a cascade of small failures. The Hastings cutoff, the late departure, the poor planning, the loss of Reed, the early snow, the inadequate leadership, the lack of rescue coordination. The survivors who did make it out lived with the consequences of those failures. Some coped by silence. Some coped by writing. Some coped by denial. None of them ever forgot. The documentary record is still incomplete. The survivors disagreed. The archaeology confirms the cannibalism but does not explain the motives. The legal cases were dismissed. The moral judgment is left to each generation. What would you do? The question is unanswerable. But it forces us to look at the Donner Party not as a freak occurrence but as a warning. The wild is still wild. The mountains are still cold. The human body is still fragile. The systems that protect us are still dependent on trust, preparation, and luck. The Donner Party had none of those in sufficient measure, and so the story continues. It continues in the history books. It continues in the silence of the survivors' descendants. It continues in the cut marks on the bones. The snow covers everything, but the story remains uncovered. On the 14th of March 1847, the last survivor of the Donner Party, Louis Keseberg, was carried down from the lake by the 4th Relief Party, led by John Stark. For weeks Keseberg had been alone in the Murphy cabin, surrounded by the dead and the remains of the dead. He was barely alive. His legs were swollen. His mind was clouded. When the rescuers arrived, they found Tamsen Donner's body near the cabin. They found George Donner's body at Alder Creek. They found pots containing human flesh. Keseberg was accused of murder. He was accused of killing Tamsen for her money. He was accused of eating her body. He denied it. He said she had died of exhaustion and cold after trying to cross the pass alone. He said he merely used her body for survival. The accusation stuck. For the rest of his life, Keseberg was shunned. What happened in those final days at the lake remains one of the most disputed episodes of the Donner story. Keseberg's testimony, given years later, was detailed but self-serving. He claimed that Tamsen had arrived at his cabin on the morning of March 7th, several days after her husband George had died at Alder Creek. She was weak, hungry, and suffering from frostbite. She had no food. Keseberg said he shared his own meager provisions with her, but she died that same day. He then, by his own admission, used her body for food. He also said that the other members of the relief party had already taken the money and gold Tamsin was said to have carried. He had nothing. The rescuers, however, found a cache of money hidden in his cabin. They found jewelry. The allegations of murder were never proven. No autopsy was performed. No charges were formally filed. But in the court of public opinion, Keseberg was guilty. The aftermath of the Donner Party is not only a story of survival and accusation. It is a story of how the survivors rebuilt their lives. James Reed, who had been banished and left the party before the snow fell, made it to California in October 1846. He immediately organized rescue efforts. He led the second relief party back into the mountains. Despite his own suffering, he lost his wife and several children to the ordeal. Reed became a successful rancher and businessman in San Jose. He never stopped defending his actions. He wrote a detailed account of the journey, blaming the Hastings cutoff and the poor leadership of the party. He died in 1874, wealthy and respected. William Eddy, the hunter who led the snowshoe party, also survived. He was one of the most capable men in the party, but the experience left him broken. After the rescue, he moved to California, married, and tried to farm. He struggled financially. He testified at Keseberg's trial. He never fully recovered from the trauma of eating human flesh. He died in 1859, likely from a heart attack, at the age of 49. His wife and children survived him, but the family line ended in the early 20th century. Patrick Breen, who had kept a diary during the ordeal, moved with his family to San Juan Bautista, California. He became a respected rancher. His diary, which he wrote on scraps of paper, is one of the most important primary sources of the Donner Party. It documents the daily struggles, the deaths, and the final descent into cannibalism. Breen never spoke publicly about the ordeal. He died in 1868. His children lived long lives. The Donner children, especially the daughters of George and Tamsin, were taken in by families in California. They grew up in silence. They rarely discussed what happened in the mountains. Frances Donner, who was 6 years old during the winter, later married and had children. She wrote a brief memoir late in life, but it was guarded and vague. The full weight of the tragedy was never lifted from the survivors. They carried it into their old age. The story of the Donner Party did not end with the last rescue. It entered the historical record through multiple accounts, some accurate, some sensationalized. The earliest published account was by John McGlashan, a journalist who interviewed survivors in the 1870s. His book, The Donner Party, A Tragic Tale of the West, was widely read but included embellishments. He portrayed Keseberg as a villain. He minimized the cannibalism. He focused on the heroism of the rescuers. Later historians, including Charles McGlashan, no relation, and George R. Stewart, corrected many of the errors. Stewart's Ordeal by Hunger, published in 1936, remains the definitive account. He used the Breen diary, Reed's letters, and other primary sources to reconstruct the timeline with precision. In the 190s and 200s, archaeologists excavated the site of the cabins. They found cut marks on bones consistent with butchery. They found evidence of cooking. They found the remains of at least 30 individuals. The bones were analyzed for DNA and to determine which bones had been cut. The results confirmed what the survivors had admitted. The dead were consumed during the final weeks. The archaeologists also found that the cuts were made with knives, not hatchets. They found that the bones were broken to extract marrow. The level of skill suggested that the people doing the cutting were not seasoned butchers. They were amateurs. They were desperate. The Donner Party remains a subject of intense study because it is not an isolated event. It is a case study in how groups react under extreme stress. Psychologists have examined the group dynamics, the leadership failures, the decision-making under uncertainty. The party had no formal hierarchy. They held councils, but the decisions were often made by the loudest voices. George Donner was elected captain, but he was not a strong leader. He did not enforce discipline. He did not compel the group to move quickly. The loss of James Reed, the most decisive leader, was a turning point. After Reed's banishment, the party fragmented. The Breen family kept to themselves. The Murphy family tried to lead the snowshoe party. The Donner family stayed at Alder Creek. Communication broke down, trust evaporated, the group separated into factions. They died in numbers. The weather was a factor, but it was not the only factor. The party could have survived if they had prepared. They did not carry enough food. They did not carry snowshoes. They did not carry tents. They relied on their wagons, which became traps. They built cabins, but the cabins were not insulated. They burned the wagons for fuel. They burned the harnesses. They burned the leather. When the snow was 20 feet deep, they could not forage. They could not hunt. They could not leave. The rescue system also failed. The first relief party, led by John McGlashan, was poorly organized. They did not bring enough food. They did not bring enough men. They left the weakest survivors behind. The second relief, led by James Reed, was better but still undersupplied. The third relief, led by William Fallon, arrived too late. The fourth relief, led by John Stark, finally brought out the last survivors. The delays were caused by the weather but also by poor coordination. The families in California did not know the full extent of the disaster until February. They had no telephones, no radios. News traveled by horseback. The rescue effort was reactive, not proactive. The Donner Party's story is often taught in schools as a cautionary tale about overconfidence, but the deeper lesson is about infrastructure. In 1846, the transcontinental journey was a gamble. There were no roads, no bridges, no reliable maps, no weather forecast, no emergency services. The immigrants were on their own. The federal government had explored some routes, but the surveys were incomplete. The Hastings cutoff was not officially surveyed until after the disaster. The party's trust in Lansford Hastings was a gamble that failed. The political and economic context is also important. The Mexican-American War had just begun. California was a remote province of Mexico. The immigrants were part of a wave of American settlement that would soon lead to the Bear Flag Revolt and the annexation of California. The Donner Party was not a random group. They were part of a larger movement. Their tragedy became a symbol of the risks of westward expansion. In the years that followed, the Donner Party story was used by both advocates and critics of the westward movement. Proponents pointed to the survivors who made it to California and built successful lives. Critics pointed to the deaths and the cannibalism as evidence of the cruelty of nature and the folly of unchecked ambition. The debate continues today. Some see the Donner Party as a story of human endurance. Others see it as a warning about the limits of human resilience. The site itself has changed. Donner Lake is now a popular resort area. The highway that crosses the Sierra Nevada at Donner Pass follows roughly the same route the party attempted. The pass is named for the party. A monument stands near the lake. It was erected in 1918 by the native sons of the Golden West. It depicts a family struggling against the elements. It does not show the cannibalism. It does not show the deaths. It is a sanitized version of the story, but it reminds visitors that the event happened. The bones of the Donner Party are stored at the California State Museum in Sacramento. Scientists have analyzed them for decades. They have identified the age and sex of the individuals. They have documented the cut marks. They have ruled out animal scavenging as the primary cause of the bone damage. The evidence is clear. The cannibalism was widespread. It was not limited to the snowshoe party. It occurred at Alder Creek as well. The cut marks on the bones from both sites are consistent. The people who died were butchered by the living. Ethical questions arise. Should the bones be displayed? Should they be reburied? The descendants are divided. Some want the remains to be treated with dignity. Others want them to remain as scientific evidence. The museum keeps them in storage. They are used for research only. The story of the Donner Party is not a museum exhibit. It is a wound that has not healed. The survivors did not all adjust. Many suffered from PTSD. They had nightmares. They could not eat certain foods. They avoided snow. They avoided the mountains. Some turned to religion. Others turned to drink. The children were the most vulnerable. The Donner daughters were never the same. They married but did not talk about the winter. The Breen children also kept silent. The only exception was John Breen's daughter, who told her story to a journalist in the 193's rows. She said her father never spoke of the cannibalism. He only said that they had survived. The historical record contains gaps. The Breen diary stops on February 25th, before the worst of the cannibalism. Eddie's account was written after the rescue but is fragmented. Keseberg's account is the only full testimony from the last days, and it is unreliable. The documents that remain are contradictory. Some say the cannibalism began in January. Others say February. Some say only the dead were eaten. Others imply that the living were killed. No one was convicted. No charges were filed. The legal system of California in the 1840s was not designed to handle a case of survival cannibalism. The common law doctrine of necessity, which had been used in cases like the R.V. Dudley and Stevens trial of 1884, might have applied. But no court ever heard the Donner case. The survivors were allowed to go free. The Donner Party's legacy is complex. It is a story of failure and survival. It is a story of how people react when all systems collapse. Party had no backup plan. They had no emergency food. They had no radio. They had no evacuation procedure. They had no medical supplies. They had no communication with the outside world. They were isolated. They were vulnerable. They died. But the survivors also showed the limits of human endurance. They walked through snow that reached their chests. They carried children. They ate their own pack animals. They ate their own dogs. They ate their own dead. They emerged from the mountains in the spring, thin and broken. They lived. Their descendants still live. The story is passed down. The lesson is still relevant. Every winter the snow covers the site. Every spring the melt reveals the ground. The cut marks on the bones are still visible. The story is still being told. The Donner Party is not a myth. It is history. It is documented. It is studied. It is remembered. And the questions that drove them to the edge of survival are still unanswered. Why did they trust Hastings? Why did they delay? Why did they not turn back? The answers lie in the human capacity for hope. Hope that the shortcut would be shorter. Hope that the weather would hold. Hope that they could make it. Hope that they would be rescued. Hope that they would survive. That hope carried them forward. That hope also killed them. The Donner Party's hope was not a system. It was a feeling. And feelings can fail. Systems can fail too. When both fail together, the result is disaster. The Donner Party is a reminder that the systems we rely on, maps, guidebooks, leaders, rescue services, communication networks, are only as strong as their weakest link. In 1846, the weakest link was the gap between belief and reality. The party believed they could cross the Sierra Nevada in October. They were wrong. They believed the shortcut would save time. It lost them time. They believed they would be rescued before the snow. They were not. They believed they would not need to eat the dead. They did. The modern world is not so different. Every disaster story follows a similar pattern: overconfidence, poor planning, unforeseen events, collapse. The Donner Party is a classic example. It is studied in business schools as a case in crisis management. It is studied in psychology classes as a case in group decision-making. It is studied in history classes as a turning point in the westward movement. It is studied in anthropology classes as a case in survival cannibalism. The story is taught because it is extreme, but it is not unique. There have been other cases: the Medusa in 1826, the Essex in 1810, the Mignonette in 1884, the Andes crash in 1970. Each case has its own details, but the pattern is similar. The Donner Party is one of the earliest documented examples in American history. The documentary record remains the most complete. The Breen diary, the Reed letters, the Eddy account, the Keseberg testimony, the newspapers of the time all provide a window into the ordeal. The archaeology adds another layer. The bones tell a story the survivors did not tell. They show how many were eaten. They show how the bodies were prepared. They show how the desperation escalated. The cut marks are not random. They show that the butchery was systematic. The survivors learned to do it. They practiced. They did it until the rescuers came. Today, the site is a place of quiet reflection. The monument stands. The plaques tell the story. The visitors come in summer. They walk the trail. They look at the lake. They imagine the scene: snow 20 feet deep, cabins buried, people starving. They cannot truly imagine. The reality is too far from their own experience, but they try. The story continues to draw people because it is a story about us. It is a story about what humans are capable of doing when there is no other option. The Donner Party is not a story about monsters. It is a story about people who were forced into impossible choices. The cannibalism is the horror. The real tragedy is that it was avoidable. A few weeks earlier, a few miles of trail, a different decision, and the outcome would have been different. That is the lesson. It is a lesson about marginal decisions and their compounding effects. The Hastings cutoff was not the beginning. It was part of a chain. Each link in that chain was a choice that seemed reasonable at the time. The aggregate of those choices brought the party to the snow. The story does not end with a clean moral. It ends with a warning. The next group that enters the mountains with too little food, too little information, and too much hope may repeat the same mistakes. The Donner Party is not a closed chapter. It is an open book. The pages are still being written by those who study it. The final page has not been turned. It may never be turned. The questions remain. The snow remains. The bones remain. The snow that covered the cabins in the spring of 1847 did not disappear all at once. It melted slowly, revealing the remnants of a winter that had taken 36 lives. On the 29th of June, 1847, a party of Army officers led by Colonel John C. Fremont arrived at the site of the Donner Lake camp. They had been sent to recover any remaining possessions and to bury the dead. The scene they encountered was not one of simple abandonment. The cabins were still standing, their roofs collapsed in places. Inside, the floorboards were stained. The smell was faint but present. The officers found items scattered: cooking pots, clothing, a child's shoe, a Bible. They also found bones, human bones. Not all had been buried. Some were left in plain sight, gnawed and broken. The officers collected what they could and performed a proper burial. They erected a small monument of stones over the mass grave. Then they left. What happened at that site between December 1846 and February 1847 was not a single event. It was a sequence of failures, each one compounding the next. The party had been trapped by snow that came early and deep. They had no way out. The rescue attempts were slow and dangerous. The first relief party reached the lake on the 19th of February. They found survivors in a state of advanced starvation. They brought food, but not enough. They left with 23 people. The second relief party arrived on the 1st of March. They found even worse conditions. They left with 17. The third relief party arrived in mid-March. They found the cabins nearly empty. The survivors who remained were too weak to travel. The fourth relief party came in April. They found only one person alive at the lake, Louis Kesseberg. He was surrounded by human remains. The scene was so disturbing that the rescuers considered leaving him. They did not. They carried him out. But the story does not end with the rescue. The survivors did not return to a normal life. They faced public scrutiny. Newspapers across the country reported the details of the cannibalism. The word Donner Party became a byword for horror. The survivors were shunned in some communities. They were interrogated in others. The legal system, as noted earlier, never charged them. The question of guilt hung over them for the rest of their lives. Investigators who later studied the site, first in the 19th century and then again in the 20th, focused on a different question. How did the party get into this situation? The answer lies in a chain of decisions that began long before the snow fell. On the 14th of July, 1846, the Donner Party left Independence, Missouri. They were part of a larger emigration headed for California. They had chosen to take a new route called the Hastings Cutoff. This shortcut was promoted by Lansford Hastings, a man who had never traveled the route himself. He had written a guidebook that described the trail as a shorter, easier path. He was wrong. The party followed his directions. On the 20th of July, they separated from the main wagon train. They entered the Wasatch Mountains. The terrain was brutal. They had to cut through dense forests and rock canyons. They lost weeks. By the time they reached the Great Salt Lake Desert, they were already behind schedule. The desert crossing was even worse. They ran low on water, animals died, wagons were abandoned. They emerged from the desert on the 15th of August. They were exhausted, demoralized, and low on supplies. Still, they pressed on. They arrived at the Humboldt River in late August. They followed it westward. On the 9th of October, they reached the Truckee River. They were now in the eastern foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The weather was still mild. They could have made it over the pass if they had moved faster, but they did not. They stopped to rest. They let their animals graze. They decided to wait for an axle repair. Those delays were fatal. On the 28th of October, they reached Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake. The first snow fell that night. It was not a light dusting. It was a storm that dropped several feet of snow. The pass above the lake, only a few miles away, became impassable. The party was trapped. They built cabins near the lake. Another group, the Alder Creek Camp, set up 5 miles away. By November, both groups were snowed in. The situation deteriorated rapidly. By December, the food was almost gone. The group at the lake had eaten all their cattle. They then ate their oxen. They then ate their dogs. They then boiled hides and bones. On the 15th of December, a group of 17 people, including 5 women and 2 children, attempted to cross the mountains on foot. This was the snowshoe party. They were poorly equipped. They had no snowshoes, only improvised frames made from ox bows. They carried only 6 days of rations. The snowshoe party struggled through deep snow for days. The rations ran out. On the night of the 22nd of December, a member of the party, a man named Bailey's Williams, died. The next morning, the group faced an impossible choice. They were starving. The body of Bailey's Williams lay before them. They cut the flesh from his bones. They cooked it. They ate it. They did not tell the women what they had done at first, but eventually they had to. The snowshoe party continued. More people died. Each death provided food for the living. By the time they reached the Sacramento Valley on the 12th of January, 1847, only 7 of the original 17 had survived. They were emaciated, frostbitten, and traumatized. They told their story. Word spread. Rescue parties were organized. The first relief party left on the 4th of February. They reached the lake on the 19th. The scene they found defied description. The survivors were living in cabins filled with human remains. The Breen family, who had kept a diary through the winter, noted that by that time the cannibalism was routine. The bodies of the dead were being used as food. The living had no other option. The relief party brought food. They also brought the news that rescue was coming. But the relief party could only take a limited number of people. They left with the strongest survivors. Those left behind faced another month of starvation. The second relief party arrived on the 1st of March. They found that more had died. The cannibalism had continued. They took more survivors. The third relief party arrived in mid-March. By then, the cabins were nearly empty. The fourth relief party found only Keseberg at the lake. The rescue efforts were not coordinated by any central authority. They were organized by the survivors themselves and by volunteers from the California settlements. There was no government response. The federal government was busy with the Mexican-American War. The state of California did not yet exist. The rescue was a grassroots effort, driven by the fact that the Donner Party was connected to prominent families in California. James Reed, one of the party's leaders, had been banished from the group earlier but had made it to California. He raised funds and organized relief. After the rescue, the survivors dispersed. Some stayed in California. Others returned east. The Breen family settled in San Juan Bautista. The Reed family built a large home in San Jose. The Murphy family scattered. The Donner children were taken in by relatives. The survivors did not talk about the winter. They kept silent. The historical record was filled in by diaries, letters, and newspaper interviews. The most detailed account came from the Breen diary, which recorded daily events from November 1846 to February 1847. But the diary stops abruptly. No one knows why. The archaeological investigation of the site began in the 1950s. Private collectors dug through the cabins looking for artifacts. In the 1950s, a team from the University of California conducted a more systematic excavation. They found bones, tools, buttons, and fragments of clothing. The bones were studied in the 198 and then again in the 2000. The cut marks were analyzed using scanning electron microscopy. The results were conclusive. The marks were made by metal tools. The bones were split for marrow. The flesh was removed in strips. These findings confirmed what the survivors had admitted, that cannibalism had occurred. But they also raised new questions. How many bodies were consumed? Who was eaten? The bones from the lake camp included at least 12 individuals. The bones from Alder Creek included at least 5. The total number of dead was 36. Of those, at least 17 were eaten. That is a conservative estimate. The ethical dilemma surrounding these remains continues. The descendants of the Donner Party have conflicting views. Some want the bones to be reburied with dignity. Others argue that the bones are an irreplaceable scientific resource. The California State Parks Department has chosen to keep the remains in storage. They are not displayed. They are used only for DNA analysis and forensic research. This decision has not satisfied everyone. The descendants have formed an organization to advocate for reburial. No agreement has been reached. The Donner Party story is not just a tale of survival cannibalism. It is a case study in how a series of small errors can escalate into a large-scale disaster. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time. The shortcut was chosen because it promised to save time. The delays were caused by unforeseen obstacles. The winter was unusually early and severe, but these factors alone do not explain the outcome. The fundamental problem was that the party had no fallback plan. They had no way to communicate with the outside world. They had no way to call for help. They had no emergency rations. They were completely dependent on their own resources, and those resources were insufficient. The same pattern appears in other disasters. The loss of the Titanic in 1908, the explosion of the Challenger in 1986, the crash of the Germanwings flight in 2005. In each case, a series of overlooked signals, flawed assumptions, and systemic failures combined to produce tragedy. The Donner Party is no different. The signals were there. The party knew they were behind schedule. They knew the mountains were dangerous. They knew winter was approaching, but they believed they could make it. That belief was not based on evidence. It was based on hope. The modern world is not immune to such hope. Every year, people die in the wilderness because they overestimate their abilities. Every year, people die in traffic accidents because they underestimate the risks. Every year, systems fail because the people operating them trust their instincts more than the data. The Donner Party is a reminder that the human mind is not good at evaluating low-probability, high-consequence events. We tend to believe that the worst will not happen to us. Sometimes we are wrong. The legacy of the Donner Party is also a legacy of documentation. The Breen Diary, the Reed letters, the accounts of the rescuers, these records provide a window into the human condition under extreme stress. They show how people negotiate moral boundaries when survival is at stake. They show how group dynamics change when resources are scarce. They show how the line between civilization and savagery can blur. In the end, the Donner Party is not a story about cannibalism. It is a story about isolation. The party was isolated by geography, by weather, by timing, and by lack of information. They were cut off from the world. They had no way to know that rescue was coming. They had no way to know when the snow would stop. They had no way to know if they would survive the night. That isolation is what makes the story so haunting. It is not the act of eating the dead. It is the silence that surrounded them. Today, the site of the Donner Party is a state historic park. The lake is a popular summer destination. The monument stands at the edge of the water. Visitors walk the trails and read the plaques. They look out over the snow-covered peaks in winter and try to imagine what it was like. They cannot. The distance between 1846 and today is too great, but the questions remain. The snow remains. The bones remain. At 10:15 a.m. on the 14th of April 1847, a party of rescuers made their way back down the Sierra Nevada. They carried the last of the survivors. The snow was still deep. The trail was barely visible. The party moved slowly. Each step was measured. Each breath was hard. The survivors they carried were weak. Some could not walk, others could barely speak. The rescuers had found them in a cabin near the lake. The cabin was packed with snow. The roof had collapsed in places. Inside, the floor was covered in filth. The air was thick with the smell of death. The survivors were huddled together for warmth. They had been living on boiled hides and the remains of the dead. When the rescuers arrived, they did not cheer. They did not cry. They simply looked up. They had been waiting so long that hope had become a distant memory. What happened in those final weeks of the Donner Party is the least documented part of the story. The diaries had stopped. The letters had stopped. The survivors who remained were too weak to write. The historical record becomes fragmentary. The exact sequence of events is pieced together from the testimony of the last survivors and the observations of the rescuers. But memory is unreliable, especially after trauma. The dates are uncertain. The names of the dead are sometimes disputed. The cabin at Alder Creek, where the Donner family had been stranded, was not visited by the first rescue party. It was not until the second and third relief parties that the full extent of the suffering at that camp became known. The Donner family had split their camp. George Donner was injured. He could not travel. His brother Jacob Donner had died earlier. The family was divided between the lake camp and Alder Creek. The lake camp became the center of rescue efforts. Alder Creek was harder to reach. The snow was deeper. The terrain was steeper. By the time the rescuers reached Alder Creek, many had already died. The survivors there had also resorted to cannibalism. But the evidence at Alder Creek suggests a different pattern. The bones found there show more careful butchering. The flesh was removed in smaller strips. The bones were cracked more systematically. This suggests that the survivors at Alder Creek were more organized, or perhaps more desperate. The difference is subtle, but it matters to those who study the site. The rescue of the Donner Party did not end with the last survivors leaving the mountains. It continued in the form of legal proceedings, newspaper accounts, and public debate. The survivors were questioned about what they had done. Some admitted to cannibalism. Others denied it. Some claimed that they had only eaten the flesh of those who had died naturally. Others admitted that they had killed the dying. The distinction between passive and active cannibalism became a matter of public interest. The survivors who admitted to killing were shunned. Those who claimed to have only eaten the already dead were treated with more sympathy. The legal system did not prosecute anyone. There were no laws against cannibalism in California at the time. The common law principle of necessity was invoked. When survival is at stake, the law sometimes bends, but the moral judgment of the community did not bend. The survivors carried the stigma for the rest of their lives. The newspaper coverage of the Donner Party was extensive. The California Star and the California Courier both ran stories. The accounts were sensationalized. The phrase human flesh appeared in headlines. The public was horrified and fascinated. The story spread across the country. By the time the survivors reached San Francisco, they were celebrities and pariahs at the same time. Some gave interviews, others refused. The Breen family, who had kept the most detailed diary, refused to speak publicly about the winter. They said they wanted to forget, but they could not. The diary was published after their deaths, but the family had suppressed it for years. The diary showed that the Breens had been among the most organized survivors. They had rationed food. They had maintained a routine. They had kept a record. But the diary also showed that they had participated in the cannibalism. The Breens were not prosecuted. But the diary tarnished their reputation. The Reed family fared better. James Reed had been banished from the party earlier. He had made it to California and organized the rescue. He was seen as a hero. His children had survived the winter. They had been at the lake camp. They had witnessed the cannibalism. But because Reed was the rescuer, the family was treated with more leniency. The public narrative shifted. Reed became the central figure in the rescue. The other survivors became footnotes. This selective memory shaped the historical record for decades. The first book about the Donner Party was published in 1815. It was written by Charles McGlashan, a journalist who interviewed many survivors. His book was sympathetic but factual. It described the events in detail. It did not shy away from the cannibalism. McGlashan's book became the standard account. Later historians built on his work. In the 193's rows, George Stewart wrote Ordeal by Hunger, which remains one of the most authoritative books on the subject. Stewart used the Breen diary, the Reed letters, and court records to reconstruct the timeline. He did not romanticize the story. He presented it as a case study in human failure. The archaeological and forensic research of the late 20th century confirmed much of what Stewart had written, but it also revealed details that the written records had missed. The bones from the lake camp showed signs of cooking. Some bones were boiled, others were roasted. The bones from Alder Creek showed signs of having been split with an axe. The cut marks were consistent with the tools that the party had brought. The researchers also found traces of human tissue on the tools. The evidence was circumstantial but strong. The cannibalism was not a rumor. It was a fact. The forensic analysis also revealed the ages and genders of the victims. The bones of children were found among the remains. The bones of women were found. The bones of men were found. The cannibalism was not selective by age or gender. It was determined by availability. Those who died were eaten. The living had no other source of food. The question of whether the living killed the dying has not been resolved by the bones alone. The cut marks on some bones suggest that the flesh was removed from individuals who were still alive at the time, but that interpretation is disputed. The forensic evidence cannot prove intent. It can only show what happened to the body after death. The Donner Party also raised questions about the role of women in survival scenarios. The women in the party were largely responsible for the daily work of survival. They cooked, they cleaned, they cared for the sick. They also participated in the cannibalism. The diaries and letters show that the women were less likely to be accused of committing violence, but they were equally complicit in the consumption of human flesh. The gender dynamics of the winter have been studied by historians. Some argue that the women were more resilient because they were accustomed to managing domestic tasks in extreme conditions. Others argue that the women were simply less visible in the historical record and thus escaped the worst of the public condemnation. The long-term psychological effects on the survivors were profound. Many suffered from depression, alcoholism, and social isolation. Some changed their names. Others moved away. Some refused to talk about the winter for the rest of their lives. The Breen family relocated to San Juan Bautista, where they ran a hotel. They did not speak of the winter. When visitors asked, they changed the subject. The Reed children grew up in San Jose. They married and had families, but the trauma resurfaced in later generations. The descendants of the Donner Party have reported higher rates of depression and anxiety. The genetic legacy of trauma is a field of study that continues to evolve. The question of whether the psychological damage of the winter was passed down is not settled, but the anecdotal evidence is suggestive. The site itself has become a place of pilgrimage. The Donner Memorial State Park was established in 1907. The monument was built in 193's. It stands 70 feet high, the depth of the snow that winter. The monument is inscribed with the names of the dead. Visitors come from around the world. They walk the paths. They read the plaques. They stand at the edge of the lake and look up at the mountains. Some leave offerings. Others take photographs. The emotional response to the site is varied. Some feel sadness. Others feel curiosity. Some feel a sense of connection to the past. The park rangers have developed programs to educate visitors about the history, but the story is not an easy one to tell. The cannibalism is a barrier for some. Others see it as the most important part of the story. The Donner Party has also been the subject of artistic interpretation. Films, novels, and plays have been produced. The most famous is the 1944 film The Donner Party, which was produced during World War II. The film emphasized the resilience of the American pioneers. It downplayed the cannibalism. Later works were more explicit. The 1992 documentary by PBS provided a detailed and unflinching account. The 2003 novel The Hunger by Alma Katsu fictionalized the story with supernatural elements. The Donner Party has become a cultural symbol of extreme survival. The phrase Donner Party is used metaphorically to describe any situation in which a group of people is forced to make unspeakable choices. But the metaphor is often inaccurate. The Donner Party was not a single group that made a single choice. It was a series of groups that made a series of choices. Some survived. Some did not. The choices were not made in isolation. They were shaped by the conditions. The conditions were shaped by the environment. The environment was shaped by the weather. The weather was shaped by chance. The chain of cause and effect is complex. The story cannot be reduced to a moral lesson. It can only be told as it happened. The historical investigation of the Donner Party continues. Each generation brings new tools and new questions. The DNA analysis of the bones has revealed information about the health of the party. Some of the survivors had genetic markers for diseases that would have made them more vulnerable to starvation. Others had genetic markers for resilience. The analysis also raised questions about the identity of the remains. Some of the individuals buried at the site have been identified. Others have not. The descendants have requested access to the DNA data. They want to know if their ancestors were among the eaten. That request has been denied by the California State Parks Department. The ethical debate over the remains is ongoing. The Donner Party is not only a story about the past, it is a story about the present. The wilderness is still dangerous. The human mind is still fallible. The systems that we rely on, communication, transportation, emergency response, can still fail. The Donner Party is a reminder that the difference between survival and death is often a matter of days. A few days earlier and the party would have crossed the pass safely. A few days later and the rescue would have arrived too late. The timing was everything, and timing is never guaranteed. The final rescuers left the lake camp on the 21st of April 1847. They carried the last survivors. The snow was melting. The trail was slushy. The rivers were rising. The rescuers had to wade through water. The survivors were placed on makeshift stretchers. They were wrapped in blankets. They were carried down the mountain. The journey took 4 days. When they reached the valley, they were met by a crowd. The survivors were taken to Sutter's Fort. They were given food, clothing, and shelter. They were told that the winter was over. They were safe. But they were not safe. The memory of the winter would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The last survivor of the Donner Party died in 1936. Her name was Isabella Breen. She was 11 years old during the winter. She had been one of the children at the lake camp. She lived to be 90. She never spoke publicly about the winter. She died in her sleep. Her death marked the end of the living memory of the Donner Party, but the story did not end. It was passed down through diaries, letters, photographs, and bones. It was passed down through the landscape itself. The Sierra Nevada is still there. The lake is still there. The pass is still there. Each year the snow falls. Each year it melts. The tourists come. They take photographs. They buy souvenirs. They walk the trails. They read the plaques. They try to imagine. They cannot, but they try.